Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
fait grand plaisir
I'm very happy to be here with you.
cette quatrième session
This is our fourth session. We're here to demystify the megadata in social sciences. We have a heavy schedule, but this is the first time we're live. I would like to welcome you. We are a very stimulating period in social sciences. We have access to all sorts of data. We have a great capacity by using computer. This is really rich. We can use, for instance, we use a term in economics, and the potential is enormous. We have a tsunami of data. This forces us in social sciences to do even more. Today's topic will have, we will talk to methods and tools in order to do analytics. We will see how we can manage all this quantity of data. I would like to thank the chair of Social Science of Canada, and this allows us to finance these events. I would also like to thank the work of Davide Pulizuto. And also, I would like to thank Solas Pelletier. Thank you for organizing all these events. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Davide Pulizuto. And he will be introducing the next part of the event. Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for all of you to be here. Thank you to everyone who has accepted the invitation. We're going to talk about different methods, different approach and analysis in social science. So we have here Madame Hélène Vidot-Delerue, who's a professor at UQAM holder of project management chair. We have Marc Fredette, who's a full professor of the Department of Decision Science at HEC Montreal, and he's co-founder of Cube, an analytics platform, principal collaborator of NSERC Prompt Industrial Research Chair in User Experience, and he's member of the Tech3 Lab Steering Committee. We also have René Morisette, Senior Economist at Statistic Canada, who has extensive experience using microdata. Mr. Morisette has a strong experience in teaching economics and statistics in social sciences. Thank you very much, Mr. Morisette, for being with us. We have also here Christian Bourque. He's Executive Vice President and partner and leads the Montreal team of nearly 30 researchers at Léger Marketing, one of the most famous marketing research firms in Canada. He's there since 1999. He's also an analyst at Radio-Canada, the French CBC, and teaches research methodologies at the University of Montreal. We wish Madame Sicotte would be with us, but unfortunately, she cannot be with us today. So very quickly, let me ask you the first question. I would like to provide you a little intro. So we're talking about social science and data. And there's a distinction between qualitative data. They are describing everything. and this is expressed through natural language. And there's the quantitative data that conveys other kinds of information. This is expressed as numerical values. So we'll see with these experts, we're going to tackle these questions with our different experts. So first question, I'll ask Mr. Morisette, Mr. Fredette, Madame Delerue, Mr. Bourque. Let me ask you a question. This is an open question. Tell us about your experience. But first question, what is an analysis method and how would you describe accessing methods? How will you describe them in human sciences and social sciences? Thank you very much, Mr. David. For me, an analysis method is a tool. This allowed us to answer a precise research question. The analogy that I often give is that the researcher has a log of wood. He has a pair of scissors, and the tools are a way to do the analysis. This allows us to see the sculpture behind the log of the tree. This allows us to answer a precise question, and there are three types. It may be a descriptive. For instance, are we trying to describe facts? For instance, what is the wage gap between men and women currently in Canada? So we're trying to describe a fact. Second is a causal effect. We're trying to identify and sometimes quantify the relationship between cause and effect between a variable and the phenomenon. To give you an example, what is the impact of the minimum wage on the youth employment in Canada? Or what is the impact to raise bursaries? And what is the impact on low-income families? So these are cause and effect. And the third one is a predictive. We're trying to predict the best way to predict something. For instance, what are the variables that predict immigrants in Canada? So descriptive, causal, and predictive. And for each and every one of them, there are different methods. And I will stop here. Madame Delerue. No, of course, I agree with has been said. I would say that it is also a way to connect, understand, and gather information from the data. Data can be words or numbers, but when we're talking about words, well, it's easier to put words in numbers than numbers in words. I would say that the different methods that we can find have evolved, and it has evolved with by using other disciplines. For instance, I'm in management, and we have methods that come from other disciplines. For instance, statistics. This is the basis of quantitative methods. So these methods are based on numeric data, and these tools have also evolved, and this led to other tools, and this has led us to develop software. And now we can all use these quantitative methods. So today, when it comes to the methods, the gap is getting smaller and smaller between the different methods, qualitative method and quantitative methods. A few years ago, you had two kinds of researchers, one that would use one method, one that would use the other methods. However, today, we see that there are some tools that are being used in research, and this links and or there's studies or analyze quantitative methods and qualitative methods. There are some specific software that are being created, and we can use this in different fields. So in all this evolution, this all leads to some changes in other fields. There are some methods by using qualitative methods influence the quantitative methods. Mr. Fredette. Hello. First of all, I teach at HEC, but my training is in statistics. So my answer will be similar to Mr. Morisette from Statistics Canada. And my answers will be talking about quantitative. I don't really work in qualitative. I find it interesting. Sometimes we don't try to make the distinction between the tool, the method, the data, and often professors, we use tools and we create them. I want to use one tool over another. We create all kinds of tools. And when sometimes people come to see me and they say, okay, I want to use neural networks because I know that you're developing your neural networks. But sometimes I have to use a reverse way to work. We identify the methods, we take a look at the data, and then the combination will tell us which tool to use. So yes, of course. My answer is very similar to Mr. Roxell. By some of the terms, for instance, there is causal, predictive. I would use inferential rather than causal. I think it's very similar. But what I would like to mention here is the following. What is a method? Fundamentally, the key is identifying a need. I see my students, we get some data, we always think about the tools that we can use, but we don't ask the question when we get some data, when we have a problem, we don't always identify what the need is. Why does this business want to analyze this database? Why does this researcher wants to find something in that field? So what we want to do is what leads us to the method. We have to use an inferential way. So we have to identify the need, then we know the method, then we compare, then we analyze with the data, and then we have the final tool. Mr. Bourque. Yes. I don't want to repeat what has been mentioned. The toolbox analogy is often used. This is how I started in my field. When we're talking, I work with polls. We are here in a prescriptive science. We have problems. We want to find a solution. We take a look at the toolbox. Sometimes businesses want to come to us, and political actors or companies come to us with a problem, and we use the problem, and then we try to see which tool fits best to solve the problem. I think that in my training made me, sometimes we say, all hammers see all problems as nails. So what I tried to do is to use different kind of approaches to find the best methods. And sometimes we feel frustrated. So over time, I went to qualitative. And when I'm talking to my students and I explain the techniques, I always show them the Magritte tip. So everything that we do in research is a representation. We're trying to reproduce some reality. So we're trying to use some techniques, qualitative techniques, quantitative techniques, but in every representation, there is something that changes the reality that we're trying to observe. My professor back in the day told me that there's a limit to this. There are some limits, but researchers want to push the limits. And that's why we try to integrate new approach, new methods, because we always feel that the tools that we're using have limits. Let me ask the second question then. In order to, Mr. Bourque, you said that there is a variety of analysis in social science, and it is difficult to define in the time we have available. But in your everyday work, what do you think are the advantages of such variety? And is it possible to combine these methods? Yes. Things must fit. That's what we hope. More often than not, what worries us is that between someone who participates to a research, someone who has saw all kinds of stimuli, these people have emotions, values, and what we're trying to see is how can all of this be transposed into a decision and then action? And with the evolution of the methods, well, we have seen some kind of evolution where we're trying to find a cause and effect by imposing some predictability to human behavior. This is a bit of the golden age in the factorial factor, but these approach have some limits. Then we move to other mathematical models. We had other methods that we used over time, and we're trying to reproduce the way people make their decision to then see what motivates them or not. But there are some limits where the qualitative methods comes and fills a certain gap. Then, in the end, we ask 50 questions, we see the results, we put this into the SPSS blender, and then we had as many questions that we had answers. So that's why we decided to move to qualitative methods, to ask the greater why. And most of the time, that why is in what is not said. But in the quantitative poll, well, we're trying to put people into certain frames that didn't really exist in their mind, because in life, we don't evaluate everything from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 7. So that's why the qualitative methods come to fill some gaps that we may find quite important. in order to better understand people.
Monsieur Fredette, je vous voyais
Mr. Fredette,
passer la parole.
now I will let you answer. It's true. It is an advantage to combine different methods. It's very hard for me to speak about the qualitative aspect. Our work is to make quantitative qualitative, but in that angle, we combine methods. A small definition, I will try to be brief, but what we're trying to do with data, we have two categories. We have supervised or non-supervised learning. Non-supervised, well, there's no variable that guide us. So for instance, when we're trying to cut a client database, I will do a descriptive analysis. I will put things into different segments. I will identify them. And then by some sort of miracle, I will identify a segment of clients that are leaving, others that are much better. And then I have a variable that interests me. Yes or no, there's that person in that segment. And then there's another method that comes in. And then we'll do supervised learning. Can we predict if someone would be either here or there? And can we, with cause and effect, determine what makes one individual either here or there? So we have to use over time, use different methods from the same database. This is an advantage. Madame Delerue, I'm sure that you like the qualitative that becomes quantitative, as explained by Mr. Fredette. So I'll leave you the floor. I agree. This is a bit of what I said before. We can transform them into a number and then use quantitative methods, and the variety of the methods that are qualitative, quantitative, and the variety of all the methods available allow us to better understand a phenomenon that we're trying to understand. Because in quantitative, we try to find a link, but the best way requires us to do some more push studies in order to understand how these links are explained. So it happens, sometimes I may have results. We can have a hypothesis between two variables, and then we establish a probability that is statistically true. And then finally, why do we have that link? We have to dig a bit further, or perhaps work from the other side to use qualitative, where we can explore perhaps where some links understand, and we want to see if, when we use a greater number, the validity of these links or of these causes that may be used in one phenomenon or another. And Mr. Morisette, you're the last one to answer this question. I agree with Mr. Fredette. That being said, I can bring you a number of examples to illustrate the different kind of methods. The first example is that for a great number of years, economists were wondering why, when there is a recession, why didn't businesses lower the wages? Why would they fire people rather than reduce salaries? And economists tried tried really hard to find an answer and they could not. And one day, an economist decided to meet 300 American CEOs. And he asked, when things are doing badly, why don't you reduce wages? And the CEO said, basically, that lower wages would have an impact to reduce morale and reduce productivity. And that was the reason why businesses didn't lower wages. So the understanding that economists would have in order to determine what are the salaries in case of a recession, everything was understood after doing 200 interviews with CEOs, with American CEOs. So the second example, in Canada, we often say that there are some barriers for workers to work from one field to the next. For what we mean by that is that workers don't move from one province to the next. And we did a lot of analysis on workers in Canada. And then I decided to add and ask people, if you had another job in another province or region, would you accept it, yes or no? And if you do not accept it, why not? And the main reason is that people want to remain close to their friends or family. And there's all this social network that is fundamental for their well-being. So this is the second example. This is why qualitative questions allowed us to have a better understanding. We understand now this better with wages during a recession, and also we now understand the reason why many workers are not willing to move from one place to another in Quebec and in Canada. Thank you for this excellent answer. It is very interesting. You know, in quantitative aspects, there's a variable that interests us. We want to optimize it. But there's the social mission of the business, etc. And these are aspects that are different to quantify. They're different. For instance, and we had machine learning with big data to optimize the number of people who would go to a concert. And if we had to analyze several data, then we would, let's say if we had to offer English concert during Francophonie, which is French concerts, then we would have even more people, but it would not answer the fundamental question. Let me ask Madame Delerue a question. Is there one qualitative method or several? Can quantitative data be analyzed with only one approach or with several? How can we synthesize these differences? So I'll like you to make the difference between both. So for the first part of the question, is there one qualitative method or several? I would say that no. I would say that this rests on several points. The first question is, why are we doing the research? Because qualitative is based on words. Words are based on language. So how can we consider language? is language a way of communication or a process of communication? And then we have two different ways to analyze words. For instance, when we analyze speeches, or language is a reflection of culture. So we're either on connective aspects by considering that language is being created with the interaction between individuals. And then we have other kind of qualitative methods. And these methods rest on data collection. And then we can say that we're looking for some patterns within languages. And then we have other methods, because we may think of different kind of methods. We can try to identify some links. We can take a look at all kinds of theories, or simply we can try to understand a phenomenon. So qualitative methods are very low. And I come from the world of statistics, and I thought about the question, are there several qualitative methods? But for me, there are several methods depending on what I'm saying. But can we say the same thing about quantitative methods? So I feel that there are more tools in the quantitative. But I think that they're still all about the same, although the tools are different. So I don't remember the end of the question. Can we...
Tout est sur la bonne voie, Hélène.
Alors, synthétiser.
You're on the good road, Hélène. So these are the differences. Let me leave to Monsieur Morisette to continue on with this question. And the question was, is there one qualitative method or several? Now, since you have the floor, and this is the first time that I'm at this type of baton race, he calls it, but it's okay. So, relay race. For myself, as an economist, again, let me go back to the distinction between that I was making before and previously. There are several methods which are quantitative, and many tools which are quantitative, which will answer questions of a different nature. Let me give you some examples, this to be more concrete. For example, if the research question is the following, if it has to do with comparable employment, how do women actually gain less money than men? There will be an analysis there of regression, of decrease, of a variety, which I will keep into account different professions, different levels, different types of employment, and between men and women. This decrease and this regression will permit me to answer the question, moreover, that is to say, in the comparable employment phase, what is the gap between the salary between men and women? Now, this will be an analysis of multivariate, of regression, linear regression, and of which I will probably obtain equality. The women will receive 10% less than men. It's a question of a descriptive nature. Now, if the second part of the study, I'm looking forward to answer the question, what is the causal impact to have on the between women, in which measure the fact to have children of women will penalize them in terms of the growth of their salary and promotions. This will kind of put together or crush that gap. I'll bring it together. Now, the causal question, will have to use another statistical method without going into details. I will have to use another statistical method to be able to answer to this question here. And therefore, There are different techniques, statistics, which will permit us to answer to different questions, research questions, different nature of questions, and these methods have been developed in response to the needs to distinguish between questions of a different nature, descriptive, causal, or inferential. And of course, finally, in the predictive nature for it. Thank you very much. Monsieur Bourque, yes. Well, actually, there is the methods, the quantitative method is relatively large, a big category. What we see in the last 10 to 15 years, it's the nature of the data that has changed rather that and the methods that we employ. Whereas before, our subject or our study subject was the human being. We would speak to the human being through or via polls or other methods. Now, it's more the traces of on a numeric platform, a digital platform that is, and then they are repertoired by corporations and they will act. This will open up new avenues for us and has opened up to understand them. It's the big data, megadata, big data. And so what we do now in a quantitative method, I think we're still in the process with these older methods. We're still attached to them, but a big revolution nonetheless in the quantitative. And as we observe, then yes, there's artificial intelligence, the techniques which we are employing, but it's more a revolution in the data that we have before us today that modifies the quantitative. In turn of qualitative now, the tools are staying relatively the same. Sometimes we can make a distinction between data that are based on language or expresses themselves on something versus the observational type of data or methods. But this is the evolution seems it's not the same. That means in terms of quantitative, it's the data. That revolution has taken place, which is the big step that has been taking place in the last few years. Thank you very much, Monsieur Fredette. Well, I can maybe just add something to that on 2 points for Monsieur Bourque said. First of all, yes, there are different tools available, but I think there are also different methods in the quantitative method. Sometimes the same tool could be used for the two methods completely different. And then once we're talking about the inferential model, for example, in the two cases, the regression could be used, causal regression, and not take into account. Once we do this regression, we have to ask, if I'm doing this regression to predict something, am I doing the regression actually to understand something? So yes, it's a regression, but the way that we will look at it could be completely different. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but it could be dramatic for the models of inferential models. Now, for what predictive models are concerned about, it's not that serious. However, even with a tool, there are different methods that could be used. And to come back on what yes, the methods do change with time because of the nature of the data. And I think inaudible. We lost your sound. Monsieur Fredette, you are inaudible. We'll get back to you shortly, sir. We have lost your sound. I think, let me go to the next question. I'll just ask any question. We did lose you, Monsieur Fredette. Yes, you're back. And he just wants to ask a question of precision. Actually, it's more a precision for you. It's a question actually which pertains. I'm on the certain knowledge, and I just want to bring on the table a variety of possibilities. Now, if we want to give a small advice, for example, to students, regardless where they want to start, I see a lot. I see already that the answer could be problematic. First of all, what are the needs? But quickly, could you please assure or reassure of these immensity of possibilities? What would you say to these students? To guide them or to reassure them? Well, both phases, yes. Well, in what has to do with guiding them, I'm sorry, I'm not. I just want to mention the data are really longitude. There are little the models are, we don't have one point of method here. This morning, for example, I was in a course, a consulting course. They are analyzing, I don't want to name them, a company that rents bicycles in Montreal. And they were looking at the impact of the publicity. So they have usage data, they have publicity, marketing data, publicity data. So if there is a campaign, a publicity campaign or advertising campaign, then they are going to get data from Environment Canada to see the level of precipitation each day, if it will rain or snow. Or so now there are a lot of data which are external, which be very, very important as a control variable. And therefore, I have to develop my reflex. If something else that can help me except for the data that I have present, that could be also a question to be asked.
Quelqu'un d'autre qui veut répondre? Je vais te passer bientôt à nouveau la parole, Catherine.
We'll go. Is there, I don't want to just turn on this subject, but if any of you have anything to add, please go ahead. Certainly. I think that in all the exercises, says Monsieur René, quantitative, and I'll put in all the quantitative exercises, the question which is always the elephant in the room is the statistical correlation between variable A and variable B could be due to many other factors which play a role, and therefore one of the big challenges in the statistical world to understand from what Monsieur Fredette was saying, one of the great challenges in statistics world to have a whole image which is sufficiently rich in variables to control and have the correlation, which I observe, which goes to a relationship, causal relationship. Let me take a simple example. For example, if I take a correlation between the level of education and the level of revenue, I will have a positive correlation in general. But this correlation is not necessarily caused by the level of education. Could be a hidden fact that the individuals that have a higher level of education have larger capacities, their intellectuality is much bigger, and we cannot sometimes control this through the different capabilities. It is difficult to go a little further and canvas this out. because the correlation, the positive correlation between education and revenue. So there, I would need a whole variable, an integral part, variables, and an ensemble equals and also a natural experiment, which will put the individuals in the laboratories in a quasi random aleatory state. Madame Delerue, someone else would like to take the
Une réponse peut-être plus émotionnelle.
I would have probably a more emotional answer. I think once we make a choice of methods, it is also in our brain that these methods have been developed by different methods. I took the qualitative hat, for example, when I hear the colleagues. However, I think we have a certain type of rationality. The students will not choose the quantitative because they're afraid of statistics and numbers. So I don't have to be a statistician to do this in each case in management, where I am. We have a problem. We use tools, which we know about, but the usage has been really put forward by software that actually dictates our work. So these are accessible types of software which are available, but we put our hand in the machine itself, he says, and we use statistics to answer to these questions. Though we're not statisticians, this is very important because the choice of the quali method and the versus the quanti method. Another thing also, this part here, I find the choice of a method comes from the individual. We are sensitive to what? Are we sensitive to words, to numbers? Are we the feasibility of that research also is a point which I would like to broach. And also in terms of the individual himself, what does he think or she think? Some people are not convinced at all by the quantitative methods because don't think a questionnaire could actually evaluate from 1 to 5. So therefore, so it's more interesting that don't have this point of view. So it's more an emotional response, I would say, says Madame Delerue.
Ouais, ben, si je peux ajouter aussi, souvent,
If I could just add, so often, we will, at the moment of actually formulating this research, quantitative research, we will leave all the if you want, the toolbox on the side to test the validity of our indicators, our quantitative, and to put or to integrate or to insert. It would be very important. A very short example. So we want to develop an indicator which to calculate the prevalence of conjugal violence. For example, we developed an indicator which was based on certain number of gestures, violent gestures, and the frequency of when those gestures were posed, how often they were posed. So we tested it in a quantitative. We were missing half of the story. So by administering our indicators to our participants, they said, these gestures here never happen, but I'm always afraid that they will occur. So therefore, we said there's an aspect of conjugal violence we did not integrate into our indicators. Again, this thing with the hammer, the nail, the hammer effect. There's a perception there of the danger. At which point do we think that this imminent danger will actually be carried out? So the qualitative actually contributed our indicative, quantitative, but even at the moment of actually putting and to transform this research and to put it into mensurations, which is measurable, then our method quantity in the most traditional methods, this would probably apply, says the gentleman.
Merci à tous les quatre. Je pense qu'on
Thank you, all four. Let's go at the end, how to reassure our students. We're going to come back to that at the end. Let me get back now to Monsieur Fredette. You spoke a lot about the automated piece and the revolution of the data which comes forward now and are collected. So the analysis practices that are used for machine learning, if you wish, are in the progress to substitute other practices or take over them. Is there a law of complementarity? For those that did not hear or watch the first webinar where we had Monsieur Boulier who was presenting, there are three types of data, of which are data, which are web, corporate sites, for example, social medias. And there's a characterization of those three types of data. Now, we can also do the machine learning, if you wish, on qualitative interviews. We can do it on an enormous bank of data, of course, also. The event of this new method here, does it bring us towards a transition which actually searches to quantify the qualitative methods in a big way, a big level? Like it was mentioned at the beginning, you can quantify, but are we able to do that in a large scale? To take the qualitative and quantify them, the mega data, and go through the machine learning and do that. Monsieur, one of you may start, Monsieur Bourque. Very quickly, like Madame Delerue was saying, we are interested in the qualitative, but now there's billions and billions of tweets to describe a certain reality. We can go on a quantitative basis. We can do an analysis, which is a mega analysis, which goes on the language itself. Yes, it is possible to have a quantitative approach with the data, qualitative data. This is possible, yes. I'm not sure if Monsieur Fredette wants to add, but indeed, this is possible. There are certain and many elements to this question. To go back to the point of Monsieur Bourque beforehand, there was a revolution in terms of data. And I'm happy to see that there's more and more conscience of this through our public and the people. About 10 or 12 years ago, I was telling my students, and I just came to the class, according to you, were there data that was collected on you since you had woken up? And they were not conscious. They said, not at all. Now, once I ask the question, they will say yes. I used my phone this morning, and there is a Google research which has been noted down. Traffic, I used the heating, and this was measured. So there's a lot of data now, and people more and more are conscious of the fact they're being measured. Me personally, it's not a question of to substitute other practices, but it's a question of complementarity, as you mentioned in the chat. So this question of complementarity will help the machine learning, the big data. It gives us a lot of information, a lot of gleanings, predictive gleanings, that is. And however, in terms of causality, it's really difficult to say to do machine learning to do statistical inference. She says almost impossible. So therefore, it's complementarity. It's complementary. And a question of research, machine learning cannot help us. However, finally, to come back on the last point of Monsieur Bourque, we have so much data now that it's becoming more and more possible to quantify things which were difficult before to quantify. For example, us at our laboratory, we have a research. We do We do experiments, utilize experiments, user experiments, site web applications, and after to measure their experience to see at what point we did a question from 1 to 5, and then did you like the experience? Yes, no. Now, with the webcam, we could try to have an inference or facial inferences and facial images. We can make an inference through so my verbal movements through those, I can make an inference through that. We could make an inference, my motion or my standing. We have tools that will actually measure the pupil rate. So in the future, it's not tomorrow that we're going to have wearing helmets, which will measure anything from biometrics to pupil mensurations. To quantify emotions where before were exclusively qualitative. Thank you, Monsieur Morisette. Are these things that go into your daily work?
Oui, le point que je veux faire est...
Yes, the point I want to make, and it's actually complementary of Monsieur Fredette, and that is to say, in terms of the capacity and limits of Megadata in terms of analysis and inferential analysis, while the Megadata, when they arrived, many persons or several persons had thought that it would be that we would be able to answer in terms of analytical to all questions, research questions, but the reality lies somewhere else, and the capacity of researchers to answer to questions in those of causal nature, depend not only to have the whole set of rich data, but also other things. Let me give you an example here to actually put things into a concrete manner. At Statistics Canada, we have a base which include 100% of the workers in Canada, and we situated from 1989 to 2019. So this is a 31 years of 100% of the workers file, which are connected to businesses, Canadian businesses. And therefore, for each worker, if the worker is unionized, we know. Imagine your research question has to do with the unionization on workers and if it has any effect on profitability, on productivity. Maybe you will think with the database that we have at StatsCan could answer that question. This causal, the answer is no. And we cannot answer this question in a causal nature. Why not? Because the corporations which are unionized and non-unionized probably are different under a set or a collection different dimension, which is not observable to the economists or statisticians Canada. So to have a conditional correlation mentions, if I keep into account all the variables, which is my database, how the productivity, the profitability differs from unionized and non-unionized. But if I am not able to control of the quality of the management in the non-unionized and unionized, then I have a variable which will contaminate my correlation there. I will not be able then to answer that question, the causal question, in a manner which is rigorous and precise. So the megadata, the arrival brings certainly up or augments the possibilities of analysis in general, but it's not a solution or a miracle solution while we are searching to answer questions of natural causal questions. the natural causable unionized, the businesses, profitability, is a question which cannot be answered in a rigorous, even with a database which has 100% of the Canadian workforce. Thank you very much. You actually brought up a lot of questioning in my thinking, and let me ask this following question or questions. When a person answers a poll, a questionnaire, and he says, Monsieur Fredette, you invoked the researcher, which is in the discussion group with that person, or is actually reading that person, the nonverbal aspect of that person. So how will you validate the data? Because the person that will answer to the question and who says the truth, how will we assure ourselves the validity of the answer of this person? The data that we are collecting from this person, is it truthful? For example, person that answers to a poll and says the contrary of whom they will vote, for example, and they will do something completely different when the election time comes up. And they will kind of throw a red herring out. So how do we assure that will tell us the truth? Or we eliminate a certain part of respondents that, I don't know. I'm passing you the floor, Monsieur Morisette. You are before.
D'accord.
All right.
C'est une question fort difficile, très difficile.
It is a difficult question to answer.
Dans le cas de certains répondants, on peut penser que
in some responders, we can think that there might be some bias. For instance, if I had a bad experience in my last employment and then I was fired, so when I'm answering a poll and I'm being asked why I left my employment, rather than saying that I was fired, I would answer that I left by my own will. I was dismissed because there's not enough work. So there are some justification biases here. It is present. It is up to the researcher, you know, it's a case by case. If I'm asking your age, well, if I'm asking your age, how old you are, well, it's not such a difficult question, or where you live, or what province you're in. In some cases, for statistical agencies, it is possible to make some verifications by adding the data that we know to administrative data, by integrating some other polls, or if I link this to income taxes that you're producing that day. Just to give you an example, if you answer that you're unionized, well, in your income tax, in your T1, you should be paying for the union. So we can then make a match or not. But this is only doable for a small number of variables. When it comes to behavioral answers, for instance, your satisfactions toward your employment, well, no data can be correlated here. So this is a case by case. The researcher must always beware of data interpretation. Mr. Fredette, well, you have the floor now. Oh, I'm sorry about that. If you want to ask questions in Zoom, please write it down. And if you're LinkedIn, and if you're listening to us on LinkedIn, if you want to write a question, write it under comments. So we still have a few minutes left, so we'll be able to answer some of the questions. So go ahead. It is clear that questionnaires have limits. As Mr. Morisette has mentioned, are we being told the truth? Are they willing to tell the truth? As it was mentioned, there is a limit when we're evaluating something from 1 to 5. So for instance, I'm being asked a question, well, what's the percentage of 1? What's the percentage of 5? So I may never admit or say that, for instance, a facial expression or any other expression, well, it is the end of it all. We have a lot of things to learn here. It is still unknown. But for me, well, it is one more hammer in my toolbox. This will bring a temporal element. If someone uses, it goes on a website for 30 minutes, and then we can identify the moments where there was a facial movement. There is an advantage here. So if someone is answering questions, and facial expression would tell us if someone is at ease to answer these questions, but there's still a lot of noise that we don't see with a questionnaire. If I'm navigating a website, if I suddenly realize that I forgot to turn off the oven at home, then my face will change. But this emotion is not linked to the experience at hand. So this is something that is quite difficult to measure. It is one more tool, but we still have a lot to learn. I'm trying to think here about the causality tools. I was wondering, when we're observing people, is there a way, how can you tell if someone is telling you the truth? And you have raised a point. For instance, someone who may have forgotten to turn off the oven. So I'll give the floor to Madame Delerue. So put your Cali hat here. When the researcher is interpreting something that someone is saying with nonverbal communication. Yes. We always say that in qualitative research, we have this internal aspect. If we're able to see that the question being asked is a bit different. Well, whatever someone says, well, it is what they want to say. When someone is providing an answer in a questionnaire, well, they're answering whatever they feel like answering. So the method here is different. And there are different ways to collect the data. This is done through some kind of questions. When we're doing some interviews, we're asking all kinds of questions. We can make the person talk. We ask for examples. And at some point, we feel that the person might answer honestly. I have done I have asked questions to people, and some people have lied, and I could see that. For instance, managerial questions. When we're asking people questions about their performance, they will always talk about something where performance was there, where something has, when you have seen some kind of success. But if you want them to talk about some kind of failure, well, then they might simply not answer. This is something we found in some active research. But in order to bounce back on some of the objectives of that meeting, it is to say, well, listen, what is the base? What is the importance of different methods, of the variability of this, of the usage of the method? Just like Mr. Morisette has said, when it came to the question, so this is another way of triangulate this, but the problem is still there. And it is found in qualitative research. We can interpret many things in different ways. And there's a lot of subjectivity here. You have talked about triangulations. I would like to hear Mr. Bourque about this. Polling tools to predict electoral results. In the last few years, we sometimes were completely wrong. So there's some kind of triangulation that has been added. So I would like to hear you on this, Mr. Bourque. There are two phenomena. All research have shown that the electoral polls are increasingly precise. It is a very simple measure. One, behavioral, everybody. This is easy to analyze. But the triangulation, well, we talked about it earlier, but I will come to what I said in the very beginning. In commercial research, we're trying to wonder which stimuli has an impact on people's behavior. Well, when we're using tools coming from, let's say, neurosciences, we can see that there's a good convergence between what people say and what their facial expression says. How can they be betrayed by their own facial expression? And when there are some conversion elements, it is interesting for the researcher to understand it. And when something is divergent, this is also interesting. So I think that the possibility of combining both between what people say and what they don't say, well, once more, this allows us to be a bit better as researchers. And often in quantitative data and qualitative data become complementary to this, well, there are several examples. When people answer a questionnaire, a survey, a poll, but even in some of those cases, someone who answers the question, they're only answering the questions that they were not asking. And the other 100,000 questions that we're not asking, well, they cannot be answered because we never asked. So this is a partial view of reality. We have broken our nose here. For instance, when we ask newcomers in Montreal if they have lived discrimination moments in Montreal, and we were below zero. But then when we did some interviews, the number of discrimination acts, well, there were so many. So between asking a question and then living it, well, these were two completely different realities. So the quantity part did not give us much information because we did not ask the right question. So there must be complementary between methods, because people say things, people don't say things, and this is when it becomes interesting. I'll now take a look at some questions that were asked. I will ask questions about megadata. Is it easy to find causality? We've talked a little bit about this sort of far west in terms of megadata. There's another question. Well, is it possible to do qualitative by using megadata? Yes. Can we talk about something a bit more rigorous with megadata? So whoever wants to answer first, who wants to answer about rigor, far west, causality? You have lots of choices here. Well, I think that when it comes to rigor, well, I will answer that part. I was giving an example of someone who forgot to turn off the stove. That's part of the nose. I will use the word rigorous. Well, I may replace it with diminished bias. So for instance, if we're asking 10 people, this event will horribly create noise into the data. But when we ask 200 people, well, I don't think that 200 people will have forgotten to turn off the stove. So numbers are important. Noise can change from one person to the next. But in some situations, all the kind of measures that I was speaking of earlier, well, even if they are difficult to obtain, there's a promise behind this. But it's not by doing it with 6 people that will have a very specific number. Comprehensive data comes with sampling. If I may.
Les grands ensembles de données, les mégadonnées,
Megadata
augmentent les opportunités d'analyse,
makes analysis opportunities higher, but we cannot use much causality. So I would say that in some of the works that we do at Statistics Canada, well, politicians will make the decisions at the federal level. So for them to know if variable A creates an increase of B, this is a very important piece of information because then they'll be able to make the distinction and move forward on some policies. And this will push their efficiency. So if there are some data on 100% of the individuals in Canada, this is not the right condition to answer some of the questions. Why is it not enough? Because individuals self-select in different social programs, self-select in businesses, because businesses change in not observable ways. For instance, in quality of the management, in terms of investing, in terms of equipment, dimensions. And this is not something we can really observe as statisticians or economists. That being said, although there are some limits with metadata, they're not an end of it all. They increase the probability of the causal nature. Why? Because 100% data will help us to understand individual behaviors over time. And this data makes regional variation when it comes to some variables. For instance, I'll give you an example, a concrete example. Does the decline of manufacturing jobs bring lower wages in Canada? If the decrease lower wages in Canada, then the logical implication is that Canadian regions that have experienced this should have even lower decreases of their wages over a period of 10 to 15 years compared with regions that have not seen a decrease over the same period of time. So Megadata give us ways to identify through statistics, to identify some elements of causality, things that we could not do when we're asking the question to 50,000 people, because we could not obtain this level of regional precision. So in sum, megadata are not a sufficient ways to analyze a cause and effect. Thank you very much. It is a very comprehensive answer. Madame Delerue, Mr. Bourque, would you like to answer something? Please. Please. I'll be short. It's not because there's a lot of something that this thing has value. With megadata, for instance, Google can follow the evolution of the flu in the United States just by seeing how many people are asking questions about it online. So having a large sample is very interesting. Just how people browse, we can understand how young people alienate themselves in the US. Everything that is, for instance, if we want to understand the provincial election in Quebec by analyzing Twitter, well, I wouldn't learn much because not many people in Quebec go on Twitter. Many people write on Twitter, but it doesn't give us much about people in Quebec. It just gives us a lot on people on Twitter. I agree with what has been said. The question is the following. The question is linked to the qualitative method. It is true that in Megadata, we have a lot of information, but qualitative depends on the nature of the data. It is not, for instance, we could have a large text, do a lot of analysis with software that would take a sample. It is difficult work. It is not impossible. Megadata is a large gather of data. So the answer is, can the megadata be qualitative, or it depends what you're starting. And the next thing that is important to note is the research. What is the goal of the research? So the idea here is not only to use megadata. There is one intriguing question here in the chat box. This is linked to what you've mentioned before. When we're talking about behavioral science, the way we can infer different behaviors from urban, non-urban, different behavior, individual behaviors. For instance, simulation. And I remember a graph that was presented by Teresa Tam, where we could see simulation of the COVID simulation and how COVID would spread in society, and simulations that came from 1 or 2 months before. And when it came to the number of COVID cases, and the peaks were directly on what has been predicted. And this surprised me, is that the simulations were so good that we behaved just like everything was predicted. Well, simulation is predictive analysis is not the same thing, of course. But I wanted to ask you something. Can we use Megadata to gather more information, or is it by triangulating this that we can analyze different behavior by different individuals from different regions? I think it's maybe a difficult question to answer, but since we only have 5 minutes, well, I've noticed something by reading comments on Twitter. Statistical literacy. We have to understand the statistical differences. And I will predict that on Tuesday, many people will say that polls were wrong. But the thing is, the results are so close right now that anything can happen. And we don't put people, I think that people would be able to make the distinction between statistics and astrology. We don't have a crystal ball. There's a margin of error here, and we have to be able to judge if 19 out of 20 were in the margin of error. So what we're talking about now, well, we have to understand this notion. We have to take a look at the values in order to judge the quality of all the researchers making the analysis. We have to understand the phenomenon we're trying to predict. If the phenomenon, for instance, is trying to predict the structure of the age demographics in Canada, well, everything is very sluggish. Right now, we know how many people die per age group. We know how many people have been born in the last few years. So in order to simulate the evolution of demographics in Canada, well, this is less bold than trying to simulate the number of workers in Canada in 2040, because the level of employment in 2040 will depend on the impact of AI, automation, different tasks, robotics, and this will the technological changes will influence the number of workers needed. Will it eliminate the number of workers? So there are two different phenomenons. First phenomenon, the evolution of age structure in Canada. And number two, the evolution of the number of people who are working in Canada over the same period. And the second is a lot more difficult to predict, let's say, than the age pyramid. So one last example. At the end of the 1990s, when the ICT and information communication technology was being developed, if you had asked economists at a conference which field would be increasing the most in the year 2000, most economists would say it would be the ICT sectors and information communication technology. But then what happened in the year 2000? What are the two sectors that increased the most in Canada? Construction and the oil industry. So we're not even asking 50 years from now, but 10 years from now. So the difficulty to simulate or predict depends on, it really depends on the phenomenon that we're trying to study here. Thank you for this comment. Well, I'm aware of the uncertainties of innovation, but unfortunately, we'll have to stop soon. You know, during the last session, we'll talk about the ethics of data. We talked about the triangulation. We talked about neuroscience, reading people's emotion. I'm sure that we will talk about this on our last panel on ethics. So I would like to thank everyone here. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you for being here. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you. And we're going to give you a little round of applause here. You can also see little Zoom hands. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll see you next time. We'll meet again 2 weeks from now. So the recording will be available and with the translation once we have once we make the files. So thank you very much. See you next time. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.